Adrian Wooldridge and Marcus Ashworth. To you from Bloomberg Opinion to talk about what else the UK election, that for anyone who hasn't been under or has been under a rock, it was called for July 4th. I'm joined now by my two esteemed Bloomberg Opinion colleagues, Adrian Wooldridge and Marcus Ashworth. In the last, I think, 4 days, we've had a number of pledges or proposals from Rishi Sunak's Conservatives. The one we wanted to focus on today here is a rather big offer to rejuvenate Tory hopes with a plan for Great British National Service for 18-year-olds. It does feel quite improvised to come up with something like this after 14 years in office. But then it has been an idea that's been kicking around for a while. Of course, Britain abolished the National Service Program in 1960, and a number of other countries have one. So, Adrian, I'd like to start with you, since you've just published a column praising the idea in principle. Could you give us a sense, first, I guess, of what problem or problems you think Sunak is trying to solve with this proposal, and then take us through why you think it's, in principle, a good idea?
Yeah, let me say what the proposal is. It's essentially to have two streams into national service. All school leavers at the age of 18 will have compulsory national service for about a year. There are two streams. One is the military stream, people who will actually join the army and do the things that you do in the army. The other is people who will volunteer for one weekend a month for a year. Now, the problem that we're trying to solve, or that Sunak is trying to solve, is, in a word, Putin. He's recognized that the world has changed, that we no longer live in the world of the peace dividend. We live in a world in which military threat is very substantial, partly because Putin has invaded Ukraine and is making very aggressive noises, but partly because an axis of authoritarians seems to be forming between Putin, Xi Jinping in China, and Iranians, various other people, who are intent on destabilizing the global order. And I think there's been a sort of an extraordinary opening up of disagree or a gap emerging between what the security and military establishment feel, which is that we live in a very, very dangerous world, and what the average person in the street feels, which is that the really pressing issues are to do with, pocketbooks and to do with the welfare state. And the idea is to shake people up a bit and to say, look, we live in a very different world from the last 40 years. We need to prepare for that. And preparing for that means partly creating a military cadre, or training people for the military, but I think it means engineering a change in opinions. More broadly, war takes place these days on many fronts. not just the military front. It takes place on an informational front, on a cyber warfare front, on a psychological warfare front. And I think the idea is to spread a sort of capability in the population, or sort of sense in the population, that there are a bunch of people who are on the offensive and who really do want ill for the democracies, and that we need to do something about it. Now, there are other things as well, in terms of providing opportunity, in terms of linking people who might be alienated to wider society, but the essence is preparation for a hostile world.
It's interesting. I think, Sunak sold it a little bit more broadly than that, didn't he? He sort of sold it as a vehicle for social cohesion, for skills, almost picking up on some of the rationale that was in a think tank report, the think tank Onward, that actually proposed this, which called Britain's youth, unskilled, unhappy, and unmoored. So he kind of sold it more broadly, and that struck me as, in some ways, not a very conservative idea, especially because he made it mandatory instead of the original proposal, which was for an opt-out. And I guess, there's a very small percentage that will end up going into the military. I think it's 5%, so 30,000, and you get 700,000. Yep. Do you think it's been well sort of thought through? And I mean, can this work in practice? Because I hear you on the idea of, helping young people connect with the national need and giving them the skill set to be able to contribute as that need becomes more pressing in today's environment. But is there a switch that you can sort of flip that, channels hundreds of thousands of 18-year-olds into health or, wherever they're meant to be?
Well, let me address the 2 points you make. First of all, is it a conservative idea or a liberal idea with a small L? Is it compatible with our liberal traditions? And I think it is, in the sense that I think liberalism is no longer just about letting people do their own thing, which was the dominant tradition of the Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberal period. It's about something more than that these days, partly because we do face a military threat in a way that we haven't for a very long time, and partly because we've sort of reached the limits of this neoliberal paradigm, that we have to have a sense of rebonding society, that there are too many people who are alienated, who are cut off from society, and there's too little sense that obligations are also required in this world. And I think that what I admired about Sunak is most people for the last few decades have come out when they're announcing an election and say, this is what we will give you. This is what you will get out of this process. And he said, we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world in which we have to be demanding things, in which we have to be thinking about obligations as well. So I think that is the world that we live in. In terms of this business about, is it well thought out? Well, there's two questions. One is the election campaign well thought out? I think it certainly gives the impression of being more a matter of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it sticks rather than anything else. Is this particular program well thought out? I think that it's better thought out than you might think. The Onward report, the person who was a senior figure in the world of Onward, the think tank, is also now one of Rishi Sunak's lead advisors. So there's a sort of clear policy. Actually, it's something called Will Tanner. There's a clear policy sort of passage from the think tank to Downing Street. But also, this is not something that's peculiar to Britain. Many countries in the world have moving towards conscription, or some version of conscription, of national service. And the most successful, I think, in many ways, the most thought-out program has been put in Sweden, where they have this dual-track approach, with the military on the one hand and other bits of voluntary service on the other. And the chance of serving in the military, it's so constructed that it's regarded as a badge of honor or a badge of virtue, that people compete for these limited number of places, and if they get them, they get training in leadership, training in military skills, and they also become very desirable on the market. And I think throughout the West, we've had this notion that providing opportunity means expanding university places. And I think it's quite good to provide a different sort of route, partly because military service tests or rewards different sorts of qualities, like leadership and organizational skills, the sort of qualities that Marcus has, but I most certainly don't. I think it's good to have different virtues rewarded, not least because the expansion of university places has rewarded a particular type of person, which is an academically inclined person, and quite frankly, it's been much better for women than men, or girls than men. We have a real crisis with young men, much more than with young women. I think this other alternative route might be a way of addressing that problem.
Well, let's maybe come back to this question of university places and apprenticeships, because that was another of Sunak's several offers this week. Marcus, can I bring you in? Do you think this should be mandatory? We know that the 30,000 that would be selected for military service, that will be on a competitive basis. I think we're all of an age where we have grown children, and I probably, like you, I was thought about how my then teenagers would have considered that, and I guess the question that rose was, what about the poor child who is caring for or helping to care for younger siblings, or a disabled parent after school? What about the top athlete who has a chance of an Olympics, going in the Olympics? Would it disrupt their training? What about the elite musician? What about somebody who wants to work on the weekend? So of course I wonder whether in practice the idea that was put forward in the Onwards report of an opt-out made more sense than just forcing, because mandatory, voluntary, and unpaid and mandatory, all those three sort of descriptors don't seem to work great together. Marcus, what's your view? Should there be an opt-out?
I just think that this is all utter whataboutery. I mean, you guys are much more serious than I am on policy. I can just see this as a knee-jerk waste of everyone's time. This is not going to happen, or certainly not in this way. The manner in which it's been introduced, and we talk about rolling the pitch, it's been completely thrown in there at a surprise election, and it's succeeded purely, I think, only in political terms, not in policy terms here, in grabbing the headlines, and it's kept Labour largely off the Twitter feeds and news feeds in the way it would want to be in certain senses. But I don't think it's been very advantageous for the Tory campaign. So, we could talk about this for hours about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they thought it through, costed it, spoken to any of the involved mass organisations. It's going to require a huge amount of reorganisation and rethink, restructuring society. 6 weeks before our election, after 14 years of rule, I don't know why we're giving it quite so much time and attention, other than the fact that, yes, in a perfect world, we would have less media courses, university courses such as media studies, and a lot of other different stuff that goes on. University sector has got out of control a little bit, though I note that the reduction of graduate visas isn't going to happen in that sense, so we can forget about that for the moment. With regards to whether or not the military want this, I don't think they do. I don't think that there is going to be any problems for people getting out of this. You mentioned certain sort of excuses. I think it would fall apart before it even started under the current way it's been suggested. But clearly the Conservatives need something to grab onto, and they're appealing to the older section of society, not only with their pension triple, quadruple plus, but this seeming idea of national service. It's a virtue signal to the older Conservative voters. They want to turn out, who are either going to stay at home or possibly vote reform, and it's a further rejection for younger voters to even ever consider voting Conservative.
And I suppose, to your point, Sunak, as Chancellor, rejected exactly this sort of proposal, didn't he? So he's pivoted on the merits of the idea, and I guess the question is, how would they fund it if they were going to do it? And I found very interesting, in the last week since this election was called, we've had both parties say that they will fund things by cracking down on tax evasion, and both parties criticizing the other for gimmickry when they claim to be funding things by cracking down on tax evasion. So so far, no new novel ideas of funding. But I don't think the idea is as crazy as you think, for all the reasons that Adrian has said, and that we are
It's
now
not a crazy idea, Therese. It's just terribly introduced.
Yes, yeah. And
zero chance of happening.
It is a political opening gambit in a hastily called election campaign from a 15 to 20 point pick your poll deficit, and so your judgment is that also it will be ineffective in mobilizing voters. It seems like at this point Sunak strategy, as you say, is to keep, stem the bleeding and keep the traditional Tory voter on side. You mentioned the pensions triple lock plus. Give us a sense of what that's about, and whether you think is it a tax cut, as Sunak is calling it?
No, it's fiscal drag, which the rest of us have suffered for the last how many years it's been, but essentially whereby optically tax rates don't change, but as literally they're frozen in time, and inflation unfortunately very much hasn't been, we are effectively paying a lot more tax. What this current proposal, or latest proposal, would be is effectively to absolve pensioners from being subject to fiscal drag. They would, as their state pension increase, which has been increasing very healthily, bear in mind it's very low, the state pension in the UK compared to, say, the rest of Europe. However, we have a very much more attractive private pension arrangement, tax payback, clawback methodology. But it would basically mean for those pensioners who either don't own their home, or solely reliant on their state pension, they would not ever pay income tax. Is where the allowances work. Great for them, not so great for, I'm afraid, for everyone else. And then yet again, another signal to the youth of today that, in essence, the current Conservative government is focusing its efforts purely at the older members of society.
I think there's a lot of truth in the idea that the optics of this are very bad, and it does look as though the Tories are just catering to the grey vote, who are a core Conservative constituency at the moment. And it's worth remembering that when Mrs. Thatcher first came to power, she was in many ways the youth candidate. The youth was actually, pretty pro Thatcher. Now it's big, the party's become a party of old people, particularly including the old people who once voted for Mrs. Thatcher. But against the idea that it's just pandering to the grey vote, we do have pretty low state pensions, as Marcus was saying, for retirees in this country. Certainly lower than I think you get in the United States. It's pretty frightening when I was last looking at it. So this is marginal to most people's real retirement arrangements, and the problem of the sort of reactionary pro-Tory base sort of elderly voter is these are people who live near where I live, in Hampshire, and they're people with big, well-funded private pensions, particularly in the public sector, who've been senior civil servants and retired, are doing really, really well. We're not stuffing the pensioners, the state pensioners, with gold coins really in this country.
Well, we seem to have given up. We're saying that the Tories have sort of given up on the youth vote, which which cratered in the last election. We saw the Young Conservatives group basically disbanded a year or so ago. Within the party itself, which it went little commented at the time, but I thought that sort of said something about what the party is thinking.
In the 1950s, the Tories had a vast political machine, which had about 3 million members, and a very important part of that was the Young Conservatives, who were the most successful marriage market in the country, who were all about sort of social events and upward social mobility and that sort of thing. It was, and then Mrs. Thatcher, in a strange way, actually revived the young vote by saying that I'd stand for the new world of opportunity and entrepreneurship against the old sort of corporate establishment. And now the Tories don't appeal to anybody who wants to buy a house, who wants to get ahead in the world. They've become the party of elderly incumbents.
This is purely a damage limitation strategy.
Yeah.
What Sunak has is a 30% target strategy. If he can get the poll share up to 30 from low 20s or possibly even below, then he will perhaps exactly switch. Labour on around 200 seats, the Tories are on 365, and what he would consider probably a success is the complete switch of that. Labour wins a nice big fat majority around 80, which is pretty much what the betting markets are predicting, and the Tories can keep their seats to around, or preferably above 200, then I think he'll be viewed as, his legacy will be he was dealt a very difficult hand, played it as well as he could. At least he hasn't had a 1993 Canadian Conservative, wipeout, and that it really means forgetting about the youth vote that's lost. It's about turning out reluctant Tories and not leading all the Red Wall 2 back to either back to Labour or to Reform.
So do you see this?
Sorry.
No,
I was just going to say, you're saying, Marcus, that this is really about the next election rather than the coming election. It's about preserving a base that they can come back from.
But it's quite an aging base, and you're alienating, you're telling young people you need to do unpaid voluntary work because you're unskilled and unmoored and unhappy and protesting and doing all these things we don't want, and you can't get on the housing ladder. The base you're pandering to is aging rapidly, is waiting for their NHS treatment. It doesn't seem like a great building block for a future strategy. So I wonder, does it work in this election? So you're sort of dismissing all of this as a defensive play, but
it may be the most wonderful strategy that we've never come across before. It's radical. It's taking we're talking about it, and indeed clearly most of the wires have been focusing on this as it came out of nowhere. So it's successful in sucking in the political oxygen, but it may not benefit anything other than a short-term. We'll see the polls. If they move in the next 3-4 days, then I think we can start to see maybe there'll be some momentum. But to my mind, I'm looking at Starmer being more relaxed, more confident, batting away some silly jibes at himself, and a wobbly Tory start, an equally wobbly in every sense of the word Liberal Democrat start, and perhaps the only thing is, exactly what I'm talking about there. I've never done paddleboarding, and now I'm absolutely certain I never will. But at the same time, that's the big threat for the Tories, is losing the Liberal Democrat, and then Reform. They've shot a little bit the Reform fox.
How do you think Reform plays into this election? We talked about this last week. We had Bloomberg News reported that the Tories are worried that up to 100 seats might be threatened by Reform. Where do we think Reform comes into this picture, either for this election, but also in shaping the party after?
This Reform is very, very important because it's partly because the prediction of 100 seats does have a certain credibility to it. That you see numbers between 10 and 15% of Tories going for Reform. There is a real sense amongst a certain type of Tory that we've had 14 years not of Conservative government but of traitorous government. That they didn't seize the opportunities of Brexit. That they consistently betrayed fundamental Conservative principles on things like vigorously preventing refugees from coming to this country, and that I think is a significant number of people. It's particularly significant in red wall seats where they attracted a lot of significant number of working class anti-globalization voters who are in play. You have, and I think in terms of what happens after the next election, this is absolutely vital because there are two sort of arguments going around in Tory circles at the moment because the Tories are preparing for defeat and what they do after defeat. One argument is that you need to reunite the Conservative tribe, and that means bringing Reform people back into the Conservative Party. And if you add Conservative votes and Reform votes, you get a fairly decent amount. So you have to move to the right. There's even talk, I've heard former cabinet ministers talking about bringing Farage in as a Conservative candidate or bringing Boris Johnson back into whatever safe seats they can manage in by-elections. The other argument from the One Nation group of Conservatives, the more moderate Conservatives, is that's exactly wrong and they need to move back to the centre because it's in the centre where the real votes are. And then you have this peculiar situation in British politics that we have a candidate who isn't a candidate. So we have this political figure who doesn't stand for anybody, which is Nigel Farage, this big figure who said, I'm not going to stand for the Reform Party, I'm not going to be associated. But he's nevertheless on the news and front and centre all the time, a non-candidate who is a candidate.
And to be clear,
in that sense as well.
Yeah, and to be clear, Reform is not expected to get seats in the parliament.
Exactly.
So this is a party that can act as a spoiler.
It's cannibalizing.
Cannibalizes
I'm going to be quite brave here. I'm going to say that I don't think Reform's going to cut through in the way that some people expect it to. I think it still has big impact in local elections, the old European elections. I think in a general election, first past the post system, it may lose Tories some seats for sure, but I think they probably would have lost them largely anyway. And I think what Farage is doing is waiting to become the prince across the water and come back as the next Tory leader, which is, I think, his greater goal. And exactly as Adrian alluded, to try and reform parts of Reform and the Tory party back together to create a more firmly centre-right opposition to Labour.
Marcus, I was going to say, it certainly suits a certain wing of the Tory party to play up Reform's spoiler potentials, because there is, as Adrian notes, a battle for the soul of the Tory party after this. And the more the narrative is that Reform is cannibalizing our vote and we need to integrate them into the party, the more that wing of the party becomes ascendant. So it is indeed sort of unclear.
We had the party for, well, I've forgotten what it was called now, TIG or something, or the independent group, and some other change, or lots of crazy names, sort of almost trying to create an SDP sort of central party. Only just before coming up the lead of the last election. That's no talk of that at all. Labour's completely captured the centre ground. The Liberal Democrats are campaigning to the left, if anything, of Labour, and they're much more worried about the real threat, I think, for the next few years, which is the Greens taking the Labour sort of left flank. So, I think we will get some restructure. Oddly, I don't think it's going to be in the centre, and I think the Tories will go towards the right, and as Adrian was saying, they are preparing for that. And the One Nation caucus is, a lot of them are going to go to Labour, I think, furthermore, or in effect go to Labour, and the Tory party will probably refocus itself.
I think the Reform threat is probably overstated in terms of votes and seats. I think when the Tories keep saying a vote for Reform is a vote for Labour, and I think that will cut through. I think people will probably much more not vote if they're disillusioned Tories than vote for Reform. It's not like a referendum where it's or a European election. However, I do think that if the turnout is disappointingly low, the Reform argument will continue to be made by that we could have motivated these people if we'd moved to the right. I think that what Marcus is saying about capturing the centre ground is exactly right. The thing to remember about this election so far is Labour has done incredibly well. Starmer has done a really impressive job of maneuvering what was in 2019, not that long ago, a complete disaster of a party back to the centre, of creating a battle-hardened, battle-ready party, and of presenting himself as the candidate of the common sense middle of the country.
He has, and yet Starmer himself has acknowledged that he hasn't quite sealed the deal personally with voters. He's been out and about quite a lot in the last week, trying to show who he is, where he comes from, trying to establish that connection. There have been a couple of personnel problems on the Labour side that have tended to detract from some of that messaging. Is any of that going to hurt Starmer? Does he need to seal the deal any more than he has? Or are these all issues that will be for, election day plus one?
I think it's partly that that this is an anti-Tory election. This is people just saying kick the bums out, we're sick of it. But also that the expectations of Starmer in terms of his dullness are so low that if he manages to be, tell even a joke or seem to be remotely warm, people are quite positively impressed by him. I think he's a much better politician than people think.
We were talking about, I was about to say, we were talking about this yesterday. I mean, Starmer has only got upway to go, and he's handling it so far, where else he was very much more relaxed. He's put a bit of personal stuff out there, enough to show a little bit of leg. I suspect the manifesto will be nuggetry. We won't get any real commitments or anything. There'll be a lot of broad brush themes and aspirations, and basically it's just, he keeps on saying change. We'll do it differently. Trust me, I look normal.
Change, but stability.
strong and stable. I think that was
Strong and stable,
a previous candidate.
And yet you saw Peter Mandelson, the great grandee of the Blair years, saying change is not enough. You need to go further than that. You cannot build a manifesto just on the idea of change.
But they're not. Don't interrupt the enemy while they're making.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah,
the last time we had a really adventurous manifesto in this country was in Theresa May's manifesto in 2017, in which they really presented an interesting and commendable, in some ways, way of addressing the problem of community care, for older people. And it fell apart. Became almost immediately the dementia tax. So all the incentives are to be.
What did Sunak learn from that? Sunak has learned precisely zero from where May and Nick Timothy was her sort of, big brain, should we say, behind it, from the mistakes they made by introducing things from left field at the last moment. Look at us, aren't we clever? This is what we really want to do. It scared everyone. Yeah. And I think Sunak has learned precisely zero of that. Right. Whereas I think Starmer has learned.
And the flip side of that exactly is 2019, the Labour Party manifesto was voluminous. It had so many different strategies in it. It was criticized for being all over the place. It was costed, but it ended up hurting them, in a pretty profound way.
Again, though, I sort of partly agree with Marcus that it's better to be strong and stable and safe than to throw out, ideas that I happen to agree with about national service. On the other hand, if you're a party that's made the mess that the Tories have over the last 14 years, it's very hard to say vote for us and stick with the same formula. They have to sort of shake things up a bit in order to for people to look at them again.
The irony is they made such a mess of it. They've actually done some quite good things. It's that they can't get any credit for it, and that illustrates how terribly politically they have been, showing every sign of continuing that self-harm sort of trend of not actually making it very clear that some of the good things they've done on education, on net zero, cutting coal, and some economic, and unemployment's remained terribly low. But that's not cutting through at all. Starmer can say, "I will cut NHS waiting lists almost by half," and everyone goes, "Oh, well, no one's had any success doing any of this because of whatever, but we'll believe you on it." That is illustrative of how poor the Tory message is getting across, and how Labour can say almost anything it wants to.
I think that's right. That's I think a good note to end on. Maybe it gives the Tories a little too much credit for policy rather than but let's stop there. And I think we've established that the national service is potentially a good idea whose time has not come, certainly not under the current government. And let's reconvene in a week or so and see where we are with this campaign. But I guess week one, who's won that week? Final say?
That's not even easy.
Not even a contest.
It's not even
okay, so Starmer's won the first week. Polls continue to be right. Thank you both, Adrian and Marcus, for joining. Sorry about the technical glitches we had in the beginning, but hopefully people managed to stay with us. And see you again soon to talk about this a little bit more.